At 4:23 a.m., on November 9th, 1917, Corporal Edmund Eddie Ashworth lay prone in a collapsed German trench on the Passchendaele Ridge, watching 47 Imperial German soldiers emerge from the pre-dawn fog across no man's land 180 yards to his northwest. He had no ammunition left in his Lee Enfield rifle, only a coil of rusted barbed wire scavenged from the crater field and 8 bent tent stakes tied to his belt with rotting twine. The nearest British position was 400 yards behind him, beyond 2 machine gun nests that had already claimed 11 men from his platoon in the last hour. In the next 6 minutes, he would kill or incapacitate 23 enemy soldiers without firing a single shot, using nothing but improvised traps, and a technique so ancient that historians would later compare it to medieval siege warfare, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The wire sang in the darkness. That's what the survivors would say later, when the debriefing officers asked them to explain what happened on that godforsaken ridge in Belgium. When pressed for details, they'd shake their heads, faces still pale with the memory, and repeat the same incomprehensible phrase. The wire sang, and men fell screaming. British High Command would classify the incident for 16 years. The Germans would whisper about Der Drahtgeist, the wire ghost, in their trenches for months afterward. And Edmund Ashworth, the carpenter's son from Lancashire, who'd been rejected from 3 different regiments before the war for being too methodical and slow, would become the subject of the most bizarre commendation in the history of the British Expeditionary Force. But on that November morning, as the first rays of dawn struggled to penetrate the chemical haze hanging over Flanders, none of that mattered. What mattered was this: Eddie Ashworth was alone, surrounded, and armed with nothing but trash and desperation. The logical thing to do was surrender. The brave thing to do was die fighting. Eddie Ashworth did neither. He did something that no military academy had ever taught, that no officer had ever commanded, that no soldier in the entire Western Front had ever considered possible. He turned a 200-yard stretch of blasted wasteland into a killing maze, using nothing but wire, stakes, and an obsessive understanding of angles that he'd learned building roof trusses in his father's workshop. And when it was over, when the sun finally rose over the corpse-strewn ridge, the advancing German company wasn't advancing anymore. They were retreating, broken, terrified, whispering about the demon in the wire who struck without sound, without warning, without mercy. This is his story. Edmund Ashworth was born in 1,895 inches, the gray industrial sprawl of Bolton, Lancashire, where the cotton mills churned day and night, and the sky was perpetually the color of old pewter. His father, Thomas Ashworth, ran a small carpentry business specializing in roof repairs, unglamorous work that required precision, patience, and an intimate understanding of stress distribution and load-bearing angles. Eddie was the youngest of 4 sons, and the quietest. While his brothers played football in the cobblestone streets and got into fights with the Irish boys from the North End, Eddie would sit in his father's workshop for hours, watching Thomas measure, calculate, and cut. He had a peculiar habit. Even as a child, he would study the angles of things, the way a roof beam transferred weight, the way a support strut distributed pressure, the way tension and compression worked together to create strength from weakness. "The boy's not right," his mother would say, not unkindly. "Sits there staring at wood like it's going to tell him secrets." Thomas would smile and continue his work. "He sees what others don't, Mary. That's not a curse. That's a gift." But the other boys didn't see it as a gift. They saw Eddie as slow, strange, different. When war was declared in August 1914, his 3 older brothers enlisted immediately, swept up in the patriotic fervor that gripped Britain like a fever. Eddie tried to follow them. He was 19 years old, strong from years of carpentry work, and desperate to prove he was more than the quiet boy who stared at angles. The recruiting sergeant in Bolton rejected him after a 5-minute interview. "You're too hesitant, son," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "War needs men who act fast, not men who think slow. Go back to your workshop." Eddie tried again in Manchester. Rejected. He tried a 3rd time in Liverpool, lying about his hometown, hoping a different regiment wouldn't know his reputation. The officer who interviewed him was less gentle. "Listen, lad," the man said, lighting a cigarette and squinting at Eddie through the smoke. "I've seen your type before. You're the sort who'd get his whole section killed because you were too busy calculating the trajectory of a shell instead of ducking under cover. The Army needs doers, not thinkers. You understand?" Eddie understood. He understood that in the eyes of every recruiting officer, every sergeant, every red-faced patriot shouting about king and country, he was fundamentally inadequate. Too slow, too methodical, too different. He returned to Bolton in shame. For 2 years, he worked in his father's shop while the war raged across Europe. His brothers sent letters from France, brief, censored notes that spoke of mud and rats and endless artillery barrages. 2 of them were killed at the Somme within a week of each other in July 1916. The third lost his right arm at Arras and came home a hollow-eyed shadow of himself. The grief turned Eddie's shame into something harder, darker, more determined. In early 1917, Parliament passed the Military Service Act, and conscription came to Britain. This time, Eddie didn't have to volunteer. He was drafted into the Lancashire Fusiliers and sent to training camp in Yorkshire, where the mockery he'd endured in Bolton followed him like a persistent ghost. The other conscripts were faster, louder, more aggressive. They mastered the bayonet drills and trench assault tactics with brutal efficiency. Eddie struggled, not because he lacked strength or courage, but because his mind worked differently. He saw problems that others didn't see, complications that others ignored. "Ashworth, you bloody fool," Sergeant Collins would bellow during training exercises. "When I say charge, you charge. You don't stand there working out the bloody physics of it." The other men laughed. They gave him nicknames: the Professor, Slow Eddie, the Thinker. The names weren't affectionate, but there was one aspect of training where Eddie excelled, though no one seemed to notice or care: field fortifications. When the platoon was assigned to dig defensive positions, Eddie's trenches were always the strongest. His dugouts never collapsed. His firing steps were angled perfectly to provide maximum cover while maintaining clear sight lines. His barbed wire obstacles were works of geometric precision complex, overlapping patterns that channeled movement exactly where he wanted it. "Christ, Ashworth," one of his bunkmates said, after inspecting one of Eddie's wire barriers. "You building a trench or a bloody cathedral? Just string the wire up and be done with it." Eddie didn't argue. He never argued. He just kept working, kept calculating, kept seeing angles that others couldn't see. There was one person who noticed, though: Lieutenant David Pembroke, a former engineering student from Cambridge who'd been commissioned straight from university. Pembroke was young, barely 22, and possessed the kind of aristocratic confidence that came from generations of inherited wealth and unquestioned authority. But he was also genuinely curious. And when he saw Eddie's fortification work, he asked questions. "Why that angle?" Pembroke would ask, crouching beside Eddie in the training trenches. "Maximum deflection, sir," Eddie would reply quietly. "A man running through here," he'd gesture to a gap in the wire, "has to turn twice, slows his momentum by roughly 40%, and exposes his left side to enfilade fire from that position." He'd point to a firing step Eddie had positioned at a precise angle. Pembroke would nod slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're not just building obstacles. You're building a system." "Yes, sir. They call you slow, Ashworth, but I think you're the only man in this platoon who actually understands what we're trying to do." It was the first time anyone in the military had suggested Eddie's way of thinking might be valuable. The comment stayed with him through the brutal final weeks of training, through the Channel crossing to France, through the long, miserable march to the Belgian front lines. By the time Eddie's platoon reached the Ypres salient in October 1917, the Third Battle of Passchendaele was in its final, desperate phase. The British offensive had devolved into a nightmarish slog through liquid mud, fighting for gains measured in yards and paid for in thousands of lives. The landscape was biblically desolate, a moonscape of overlapping shell craters filled with chemical-tainted water, forests reduced to forests of splintered stumps, and the omnipresent barbed wire miles and miles of it, rusting in the perpetual rain. Eddie saw the wire everywhere, and his mind couldn't help but analyze it. The British wire was functional but simplistic parallel rows designed to slow attackers. The German wire was more sophisticated, angled, layered, designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. But both systems, Eddie realized, were static, defensive, predictable. His mind began to work on a different kind of problem. What if wire could be used offensively? What if you could turn the enemy's own momentum against them? What if you could build a trap that didn't just slow people down, but actively hunted them? He mentioned the idea once to Sergeant Collins during a lull in the shelling. Collins laughed so hard he nearly choked on his cigarette. Hunting wire? Christ, Ashworth, the mud's gotten into your brain. Wire's for keeping krauts out, not hunting them down. Stick to what you know, eh? Digging and thinking too much. The other men laughed too. Even Lieutenant Pembroke, who'd been supportive during training, just shook his head with an indulgent smile. Save your innovations for after the war, Corporal. Right now we just need to hold this goddamn ridge. Eddie said nothing. He went back to his section of trench, pulled out a battered notebook he kept in his tunic pocket, and began sketching diagrams by candlelight. Angles, tension points, vectors of force, the mathematics of murder written in Carpenter's notation. He didn't know it yet, but those sketches would soon become the blueprint for one of the most bizarre and effective combat actions of the entire war. By early November 1917, the Passchendaele offensive had achieved its objective. The ruined village had been captured, and the ridge that dominated the Ypres salient was in Allied hands. But holding it was another matter entirely. The Germans were desperate to retake the high ground before winter set in, and they launched a series of brutal counterattacks designed to push the exhausted British and Canadian forces off the ridge. Eddie's platoon, what was left of it, was positioned on the eastern slope of the ridge, in a section of former German trenches that had been pulverized by weeks of artillery fire. The trenches were barely trenches anymore, just muddy gouges in the earth, partially collapsed, filling with water faster than the exhausted soldiers could bail them out. The weather was apocalyptic. Cold rain mixed with sleet fell constantly, driven by winds that cut through wool and leather like they were tissue paper. The ground was so saturated that men drowned in shell holes regularly. Equipment rusted within days. Food spoiled within hours. Trench foot claimed as many casualties as German bullets. Morale was non-existent. Men sat in the flooded trenches with the hollow-eyed stare of the damned, smoking cigarettes down to their fingers, flinching at every distant boom of artillery. Lieutenant Pembroke did his best to keep spirits up, but even his Cambridge optimism was wearing thin. He'd lost half his platoon in 3 weeks, not to any grand assault or heroic battle, but to the grinding, inglorious attrition of holding a position in hell. "We just need to last until the 15th, Pembroke would say during morning stand to, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the constant artillery. "Command says reinforcements are coming on the 15th, fresh troops from England. We just need to hold until then." No one believed him. Everyone had heard that lie before. The German forces opposite them were from the 195th Infantry Division, Bavarian troops, with a reputation for aggressive tactical competence. They'd been fighting on the Eastern Front before being transferred to Belgium, and they brought with them a cold, professional brutality that was different from the exhausted fatalism of the British forces. They wanted that ridge back, and they were willing to pay for it. Intelligence reports, such as they were in the chaos of the salient, suggested the Germans were massing for a major counterattack. The plan was obvious. Hit the British lines at dawn, when the soldiers were exhausted from night watch, punch through the weakest section, and roll up the defenses from the flank. Eddie's platoon was holding what High Command had identified as precisely that weak section, a 300-yard stretch of collapsed trenches on the ridge's eastern slope, with poor sight lines, inadequate wire obstacles, and no artillery support within useful range. If the Germans were going to attack, they'd come through here. Lieutenant Pembroke knew it. Sergeant Collins knew it. Every man in the platoon knew it. "We're the sacrificial goats," Private Morrison said bitterly, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day, even though the mud would foul it again within an hour. They're putting us here to slow Jerry down while the real troops pull back to better positions." "Stow that talk," Collins snapped, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew Morrison was right. Eddie spent those days doing what he always did, working, while the other men tried to keep their weapons clean, wrote letters home they knew would never arrive, or simply sat in numb silence. Eddie worked on the wire. The previous German occupants had left behind hundreds of yards of barbed wire, much of it damaged by shell fire, tangled in the mud, or partially buried. Eddie spent hours each day salvaging it, straightening sections that could be straightened, bundling the rust-weakened pieces, sorting by length and gauge. The other men thought he was wasting his time. "What's the point, Ashworth?" Morrison asked. "We've got no posts to string it on. Half our pickets got blown to matchsticks. You gonna hold it up with your teeth?" Eddie didn't respond. He just kept working, his hands bleeding from the wire barbs, his uniform filthy with rust and mud. He was collecting materials, yes, but more importantly, he was mapping the terrain in his mind. Every crater, every collapsed section of trench, every piece of cover, every angle of approach. He was seeing the battlefield not as it was, but as it could be. As a system, as a machine. Lieutenant Pembroke found him on the evening of November 8th, crouched in a shell hole 50 yards forward of their trench line, adjusting what appeared to be a completely random arrangement of wire strands between two pieces of shattered wood. "Ashworth, what the hell are you doing out here? We're expecting an attack any time now." Eddie looked up, his face smeared with mud, his eyes intense in the fading light. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted." "When they come, sir, they'll come through here." Eddie gestured to the terrain around them. A relatively flat approach with good cover from shell holes and minimal wire obstacles. This is the path of least resistance. Any competent officer would choose this route. Pembroke looked around and grudgingly nodded. "Command thinks the same thing. That's why we're here. To hold them as long as possible." "We can't hold them, sir. Not conventionally. We're down to 38 men. No machine guns. Artillery support is unreliable. If they come with even a platoon-strength force, we'll be overrun in minutes. So, what are you suggesting? That we retreat?" "No, sir." Eddie's voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "I'm suggesting we don't fight them. We let the ground fight them." "The ground?" "Yes, sir. Wire isn't just a barrier. It's a tool. If you use it right, if you understand the angles, the tension, the way men move under stress, you can turn it into something else, something active." Pembroke stared at him for a long moment. In the distance, German artillery boomed, and both men flinched reflexively. "Ashworth, are you telling me you want to defend this position with improvised wire traps?" "Not traps, sir. A system. A maze. Something that looks like random damage, but is actually carefully designed to control their movement, slow them down, separate them, and channel them into positions where they can't effectively fight back." "That's insane." "Yes, sir." Eddie's expression didn't change, but so is trying to hold this position with 38 men and no support. Pembroke was quiet for a long time. He was 22 years old, a university student playing at soldier, suddenly responsible for 36 lives in a position everyone knew was indefensible. Every command decision weighed on him like physical weight. He'd already sent 11 men to their deaths in meaningless holding actions over the past 2 weeks. Finally, he spoke. "How long would you need?" "All night, sir. And I'd need every man who can work wire without killing himself." "That's about 5 men, including you. Everyone else would lose a hand in the dark." "That's enough, sir, if I'm right. And if you're wrong, we've wasted our last night of preparation on a carpenter's fantasy, and we all die when the sun comes up." Eddie met his eyes. "We're going to die anyway, sir. At least this way. We die trying something they won't expect." It wasn't inspirational. It wasn't heroic. It was simply, brutally true. Pembroke had spent enough time in the trenches to recognize truth when he heard it. "Do it," he said finally. "But Ashworth, if this doesn't work, I'm going to be very disappointed in you." Briefly. Eddie almost smiled. "Understood, sir." Eddie selected his crew carefully. 4 men who had some experience with wire work and, more importantly, who wouldn't ask too many questions. He gave them simple instructions: move this wire here, stake this section at this angle, create this loop between these 2 points. He didn't explain the overall design because he knew they wouldn't understand it. Hell, he barely understood it himself. It existed in his head as a 3-dimensional map of forces and angles, the kind of intuitive geometric understanding that came from years of building roof trusses and support structures. They worked in absolute darkness, with no lights permitted because German snipers were watching for any illumination. Eddie navigated by memory and touch, his fingers reading the terrain like a blind man reading Braille. He placed stakes at precise angles, strung wire at specific heights, some at ankle level, some at chest height, some diagonal and nearly invisible even in daylight. He created false paths that looked clear but led to channeling points. He built tension traps, where cutting one wire would release others. He designed collapsing sections that would tangle pursuers. Most importantly, he created what he called sound wires, strands pulled taut across gaps and connected to collections of loose wire, helmet fragments, and empty shell casings. These weren't meant to stop anyone. They were meant to alert Eddie to exactly where enemies were moving. The system he built over those 6 hours was part obstacle course, part musical instrument, part hunting trap. It looked like chaos, like the random debris of a shattered battlefield, but it was actually the most carefully planned defensive system anyone had built in the entire Ypres salient. By 4 a.m., they were done. The men stumbled back to the trench line, exhausted, their hands shredded and bleeding despite the thick gloves they wore. One of them, Private Davies, asked the question they were all thinking. "Corporal, what exactly did we just build?" Eddie looked out at the pre-dawn darkness, at the invisible web of wire that now covered 200 yards of no man's land, and gave the only answer he had. Something new. He gathered the tent, stakes 8 of them, bent and sharpened from days of work, and tied them to his belt with rope. They were crude weapons, barely a step above sharpened sticks, but they were silent, and in close quarters wire fighting, silence would matter more than firepower. At 4:15 a.m., the German artillery opened up. The barrage was brief but intense, a 15-minute pounding designed to shatter nerves and suppress any defensive response. The shells fell mostly behind Eddie's position, targeting the communication trenches and preventing reinforcements from moving forward. It was a textbook preparation for an infantry assault. The barrage stopped at 4:30 a.m. In the sudden, ringing silence, Eddie heard what he'd been waiting for, the sound of men moving through fog and darkness. Lots of men, moving with professional discipline, in multiple groups, advancing on a broad front. "Here they come," someone whispered in the trench. Lieutenant Pembroke appeared at Eddie's side, his young face pale but determined. "Ashworth, if you're going to do something, now's the time." Eddie nodded. He climbed out of the trench, not over the parapet, but through a deliberate gap he'd created the night before and disappeared into no man's land. "Is he mad?" Sergeant Collins hissed. "He just went out there alone?" Pembroke didn't answer. He was staring into the fog, listening, waiting. That's when the wire started to sing. Eddie moved through his wire maze like a ghost because he'd designed it for exactly that purpose. He knew where every strand was, which paths were clear, which obstacles were real, and which were illusions. To him, the chaos of wire and debris was a carefully mapped terrain where every step was choreographed. To the Germans, it was hell. The advancing German soldiers were good troops, experienced, disciplined, moving in proper assault formation with scouts forward and support elements behind. They'd done this 100 times before, but they'd never done it in a maze designed by a carpenter who understood exactly how men moved when they couldn't see, when they were scared, when they were trying to stay quiet. Eddie heard the first group when they were about 160 yards out, the soft ping of a sound wire being disturbed. He moved toward the sound, circling wide through a path he'd kept clear. He could see them now, barely dark shapes in the fog, 5 men moving cautiously forward, rifles at the ready. They hit the first channeling point, an area where the wire appeared to be damaged and passable but was actually forcing them into a narrow corridor. They funneled together, instinctively moving closer for mutual support in the restricted space. Eddie waited until they were exactly where he needed them, bunched together, focused forward, in a natural depression that put them 3 feet lower than the surrounding terrain. He moved behind them silently, pulled one of the tent stakes from his belt, and hamstrung the last man in line with a brutal upward thrust to the back of the knee. The soldier went down with a strangled gasp. His comrades spun around, but Eddie was already gone, disappearing into a gap in the wire that they couldn't see in the fog. When they tried to follow, they ran into a chest-high wire strand. Eddie had positioned at the precise height to catch a running man in the dark. 2 of them went down, tangled and cursing. The remaining 2 opened fire blindly into the fog, revealing their positions. Eddie didn't return fire. He didn't have to. He just waited for them to stop shooting. You can't fire forever, and when they did, when they were standing in the ringing silence trying to reload and reorient, he moved again. This time he used wire itself as a weapon, looping it around the neck of one soldier from behind and pulling the man backward into the maze. The body crashed through a tension trap, releasing a cascade of loose wire that fell on the last German soldier like a net, tangling his rifle, his arms, his legs. Eddie drove a tent stake through the man's shoulder, pinning him to the ground, and moved on. 5 men down, and he hadn't fired a shot. The singing wire told him where the next group was moving more cautiously now, having heard the shots and the screaming. These were smarter, more experienced. They'd spread out, maintaining proper interval. They were probing carefully, testing each obstacle before committing. Eddie let them come deeper into the maze. Let them get comfortable with the pattern they thought they'd identified. And then he triggered a collapse trap, a section of wire that looked stable but was actually held up by a single stake. He pulled the stake, and 20 yards of barbed wire fell like a net, catching 3 soldiers in its embrace. They screamed. Wire screaming was different from bullet screaming. It was more visceral, more desperate, because you couldn't see what was hurting you, and every movement made it worse. Eddie was already moving to the next position. He could hear more Germans now, lots of them, maybe 30 or 40, confused and angry and starting to panic. Officers were shouting orders, trying to maintain formation, but you can't maintain formation in a maze you can't see. The sun was just starting to hint at dawn, and in the growing light, the Germans could finally see what they'd walked into. Not just a wire obstacle, but a 3-dimensional web that seemed to have no pattern, no logic, no clear path through or around it. Every direction looked the same, tangled, dangerous, potentially lethal. And somewhere in that web, something was hunting them. Eddie used the sound wires like a sensory organ, tracking multiple groups simultaneously. He moved constantly, never staying in one position for more than a few seconds. He used the tent stakes with brutal efficiency, hamstringing, pinning, disabling. When he ran out of stakes, he used wire itself, garroting, tripping, tangling. When his hands were too torn up to grip wire effectively, he used his rifle as a club. He fought with the cold, methodical precision of a craftsman. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risks. He didn't try to kill everyone. He tried to disable the most dangerous soldiers and create maximum chaos and fear in the others. A German sergeant, more courageous or more foolish than his men, came charging through the wire with a bayonet, roaring a battle cry. Eddie stepped aside at the last moment, a carpenter's sidestep, using the man's own momentum, and the sergeant ran face first into a wire barrier Eddie had positioned at exactly head height. The man went down hard, his face a mask of blood. A junior officer, trying to rally his scattered troops, climbed onto a pile of debris to get a better view and coordinate the assault. Eddie shot him. It was the first bullet he'd fired all morning. 1 shot, 1 kill, and suddenly every German soldier in the maze was diving for cover, certain they were in a killing zone with multiple shooters. They weren't. There was just Eddie, bleeding from dozens of wire cuts, exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and stubborn refusal to quit. But the Germans didn't know that. All they knew was that they'd sent almost 50 men into a 200-yard stretch of ground and lost more than half of them without seeing a proper enemy force. The wire had become sentient, malevolent, impossible to fight. Der Drahtgeist, the wire ghost. At 5:47 a.m., the German attack broke. It didn't rout. These were professional soldiers, not conscripts, but the officers made the tactical decision to withdraw and reassess. They pulled back, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead tangled in wire that seemed specifically designed to make body recovery nearly impossible. Eddie watched them go from a shell hole on the edge of his wire maze. He was lying in muddy water, his hands shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, his uniform torn to shreds, his face gray with shock. But he was alive. And he'd held. Behind him, in the British trench line, 37 men stared in absolute stunned silence. Lieutenant Pembroke was the first to speak. His voice was barely a whisper. "What in God's name did we just witness?" Sergeant Collins climbed out of the trench first, moving cautiously into the wire maze, even though the Germans had retreated. He had to see it for himself, had to understand what had happened. The other men followed, one by one, walking through Eddie's creation in dawning horror and awe. The wire system was even more complex than it had looked from the trench. Up close, they could see the precision of it, the calculated angles, the tension points, the channeling corridors, the traps within traps, and everywhere, German bodies, some dead, some wounded and moaning, some simply tangled and unable to move, their eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ," Private Morrison breathed, staring at a section where 3 German soldiers were wrapped in wire so thoroughly they looked like flies in a spider's web. "He did this? Ashworth did this?" "Ashworth!" Pembroke was shouting now, fear creeping into his voice. "Ashworth, where are you?" They found him in the shell hole, barely conscious, sitting in muddy water with his back against the crater wall. His hands were destroyed, cut to ribbons by wire, the bones visible in places. His face was pale from blood loss and shock. But his eyes were alert, still calculating, still seeing angles. "Pembroke," he said softly. "Sir, did we hold?" Pembroke dropped to his knees beside him, too overwhelmed to maintain officer dignity. "You held, Corporal. You held all of them. You held with wire and tent stakes and—" He couldn't finish. He just shook his head in disbelief. "Good," Eddie said. Then he passed out. The medics arrived minutes later, part of the reinforcements that had been promised but never expected. They stared at the carnage in the wire maze like men witnessing something from another world. They'd seen every kind of combat wound the war could produce, but this was different. This was strange. "What the hell happened here?" one of them asked while working on Eddie's hands. "The wire ghost happened," Sergeant Collins said quietly. He was staring at Eddie with something approaching religious awe. The bloody wire ghost. The German prisoners, and there were 7 of them, too wounded or too tangled to retreat, told confused, terrified stories to the British intelligence officers who debriefed them later that day. Their stories didn't match, except in one key detail. They'd been attacked by something that wasn't quite human, something that moved through wire like it was air, something that knew exactly where they were at all times. It was like fighting a demon, one Bavarian corporal said through an interpreter, his eyes haunted. "You couldn't see it, couldn't hit it, couldn't escape it. The wire was alive. The wire was hunting us." The German company commander, who'd watched the assault collapse from his forward observation post, filed a report that would later be studied in staff colleges across Europe. In it, he described encountering what he believed was a new form of defensive warfare, one that combined improvised obstacles, psychological terror, and intimate terrain knowledge to create a force multiplication effect far beyond anything conventional military theory could explain. One man, the report concluded, held a company-strength assault for over an hour using no conventional weapons or tactics. Recommend further reconnaissance of British defensive innovations before attempting future assaults in this sector. British High Command didn't know what to do with the incident. On one hand, Corporal Edmund Ashworth had achieved something remarkable. He'd held a critical position against overwhelming odds, inflicted severe casualties, and bought time for reinforcements to arrive. On the other hand, his methods were completely unorthodox, impossible to replicate, and frankly bizarre. Lieutenant Pembroke submitted a recommendation for a Victoria Cross, the highest military honor Britain could bestow. The recommendation was downgraded to a military medal still prestigious, but more appropriate for unusual valor rather than supreme heroism. The citation was carefully worded to avoid specifics. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty during a critical defensive action, Corporal Ashworth, through innovative defensive measures and personal courage, successfully held a vital position against overwhelming enemy forces, inflicting severe casualties and preventing a breakthrough that would have compromised the entire sector defense. It didn't mention the wire. It didn't mention the tent stakes. It didn't mention that he'd killed or wounded 23 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat without firing more than one shot. But the soldiers knew. The story spread through the British lines like wildfire, growing with each retelling. Slow Eddie, the carpenter's son from Bolton, the man everyone had mocked for being too methodical and strange, had done something impossible. And on the German side, the legend of Der Drahtgeist became a whispered warning. Battalions rotating into the Ypres salient were briefed about the sector where the wire ghost had struck. Patrols in that area moved with extra caution. Wire obstacles were approached with suspicion, as if they might suddenly spring to life. Eddie himself spent 3 weeks in a field hospital while doctors tried to save his hands. The damage was severe, tendons severed, bones cracked, infections setting in from the filthy wire. At one point, amputation was discussed, but Eddie refused. "I need my hands," he told the surgeon, his voice flat and certain. "I'm a carpenter," the surgeon, a weary major who'd seen too much suffering to argue with a man who'd just become a legend, did his best. Eddie kept his hands, though they would never work quite right again. The fingers of his right hand wouldn't fully close, and his left thumb was permanently numb. It ended his carpentry career before he'd properly started it. But it didn't matter, because Eddie Ashworth was no longer just a carpenter. He was the wire ghost. Eddie returned to his unit in early December 1917, just as the Passchendaele campaign was finally, mercifully, ending. Winter had locked the Ypres salient in frozen mud, making further offensive operations impossible. The ridge had been secured at terrible cost, 325,000 Allied casualties for 5 miles of devastated ground, but it was secured nonetheless. When Eddie walked back into the platoon's rest area behind the lines, the men didn't recognize him at first. His hands were wrapped in bandages, his face was thinner, his eyes had taken on that 1,000-yard stare that marked men who'd seen things they could never unsee. But when Private Morrison finally realized who it was, the word spread through the billets like electricity. The wire ghost is back. They didn't mock him anymore. The nicknames were gone. Slow Eddie, the thinker, the professor, all vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Now when men saw him, they stood a little straighter. When he walked past, conversation stopped. Soldiers who'd been in France for years, who'd fought at the Somme and Arras and Vimy Ridge, looked at Eddie Ashworth with something approaching fear and respect mixed together. Lieutenant Pembroke, now promoted to captain, after the successful defense, tried to get Eddie reassigned to a training battalion, thinking his skills could be used to teach defensive tactics. The request was denied by Brigade Command with a terse note. Corporal Ashworth's methods are not suitable for general instruction. Translation: we don't want soldiers thinking they can defend positions with garbage and creativity instead of proper military discipline. But the soldiers themselves wanted to learn. In the rest periods between tours in the trenches, men would approach Eddie quietly, asking questions. "Corporal, how did you know where they'd come from? How'd you move through the wire without cutting yourself to ribbons? Is it true you killed a German officer with just a piece of tent stake?" Eddie would answer patiently, methodically, using the same teaching approach his father had used in the carpentry workshop. He'd sketch diagrams in the mud, explaining sight lines and channeling corridors and tension distribution. Most men didn't understand fully. Their minds didn't work in angles the way Eddie's did, but they understood enough to be both amazed and unsettled. "It's not magic," Eddie would say, flexing his damaged hands unconsciously. "It's just understanding how things move under stress. Men, water, weight, they all follow patterns. If you understand the patterns, you can predict them. And if you can predict them, you can control them." "But how do you see the patterns?" Morrison asked one evening, genuinely curious. "I look at a battlefield and I see mud and wire and death. You look at it and see—" "What? A chessboard?" Eddie considered the question seriously. "Not a chessboard. More like a roof that's about to collapse. You can't see the stress, but you can calculate where it is by understanding the structure. Men under pressure move in predictable ways. They seek cover. They bunch together. They take paths of least resistance. If you know that, if you really know it deep in your bones, you can turn their instincts against them. It was the longest speech anyone had heard Eddie make, and the men listened with complete attention. This wasn't coming from an officer who'd learned tactics from a textbook. This was coming from a man who'd proven his theories in the most brutal laboratory imaginable. Sergeant Collins, promoted to color sergeant, after the Passchendaele action, approached Eddie privately a few days later. "The lads want to know," Collins said, lighting a cigarette with hands that still shook slightly from shell shock. "Could you do it again? What you did on the ridge?" Eddie looked at his bandaged hands, flexing the fingers that would never quite work right again. "Probably not the same way. Every battlefield is different. Different terrain, different enemy, different conditions. You can't just replicate a solution. But the principle? The idea of it? The principle works anywhere," Eddie said with certainty. "Anywhere men have to move through restricted terrain under stress. Anywhere you can control the environment better than the enemy controls their response to it." Collins nodded slowly, absorbing this. "You know the brass hates it, right? What you did? They can't explain it, can't teach it, can't control it. It came from you, not from them, and that scares them more than the Germans do." "I know. But the lads," Collins gestured vaguely toward the billets where 37 men were resting, men who'd watched the impossible happen and survived because of it. "The lads would follow you into hell now. You know that, right?" Eddie didn't answer immediately. He was staring at nothing, or maybe at something only he could see, patterns and angles and possibilities that existed in the spaces between what was and what could be. "I don't want them to follow me," he said finally. "I want them to go home alive. That's all I've ever wanted." The winter of 1917 to 1918 was the coldest anyone could remember. The war settled into a frozen stalemate, both sides exhausted, both sides waiting for spring when the killing could resume properly. Eddie's hands healed slowly, the bandages coming off to reveal a landscape of scars that would mark him for life. He could still grip a rifle, still perform basic soldier tasks, but the fine motor control needed for carpentry was gone forever. He didn't mourn it as much as he thought he would. The war had changed him, changed what he cared about, changed what he thought was important. In January 1918, Eddie was sent on a fortifications inspection tour with Captain Pembroke and several engineering officers. The brass had finally decided that maybe, possibly, there might be something worth learning from what happened on Passchendaele Ridge. They wanted Eddie to assess defensive positions and make recommendations. At each position they visited, Eddie would spend hours studying the terrain, the wire obstacles, the firing positions. The engineering officers would wait impatiently, expecting standard suggestions about fields of fire and overlapping coverage. What they got instead was something else entirely. "This position is fundamentally flawed," Eddie would say, at one trench system that had been designed according to textbook principles. "You're thinking like engineers. You've optimized for theoretical efficiency. But men don't move efficiently under fire. They move desperately, instinctively, chaotically. You need to design for chaos, not order." "What do you suggest?" an engineering major asked, his tone making clear he thought this jumped-up corporal was wasting everyone's time. Eddie spent the next hour sketching modifications to the position, subtle changes to wire placement, addition of false paths, creation of psychological pressure points that would channel attackers into killing zones without them realizing it was happening. The engineering major studied the sketches with growing interest, his condescension slowly shifting to genuine curiosity. "This is unusual. Where did you learn these principles?" "Building roofs in Bolton," Eddie said simply. "Same principles. Stress, load, distribution of forces, just applied to people instead of wood." "Good God," Pembroke muttered, looking at the diagrams with the recognition of someone who'd seen these principles work in practice. "He's designing psychological architecture. He's not building fortifications, he's building mazes that think." "Mazes don't think, sir," Eddie corrected gently. "But men do, predictably. Some of Eddie's suggestions were implemented. Most were rejected as too experimental, too strange, too different from established doctrine, but a few forward-thinking officers took notes, filed reports, began thinking about defensive warfare in new ways. Years later, military historians would identify this period, the winter of 1917 to 1918, when a carpenter from Bolton was briefly allowed to share his theories with professional soldiers as a missed opportunity. If Eddie's principles had been adopted more widely, they theorized, the defensive strategies of World War II might have evolved very differently. But in that winter, Eddie was just a corporal with ruined hands and strange ideas, and the British Army had more pressing concerns than listening to him. In March 1918, everything changed. The Germans, reinforced by divisions freed from the collapsed Eastern Front, launched Operation Michael, a massive offensive designed to break through the Allied lines before American reinforcements could arrive in force. It was the largest German attack of the war, and it nearly succeeded. British positions across a 50-mile front collapsed under the assault. Entire divisions were destroyed or captured. The road to Paris lay open. Eddie's battalion was rushed to help plug a gap in the line near Villers-Bretonneux. They arrived to find complete chaos, retreating soldiers streaming past, artillery abandoned, officers trying desperately to organize a defensive line from whatever units they could scrape together. Captain Pembroke, now acting as a temporary major due to casualties among senior officers, found himself commanding a scratch force of roughly 400 men from a dozen different units. They were ordered to hold a railroad embankment that represented the last barrier before open country. "We're going to be overrun," Pembroke said flatly during the officers' meeting. "The Germans have been advancing for 3 days. They have momentum, numbers, and morale on their side. We have exhaustion and desperation. How long do we need to hold?" a shell-shocked captain from a Scottish regiment asked. 12 hours. Australian divisions are moving up from the south. If we can hold until nightfall, they can establish a proper defense line. If we break..." Pembroke didn't finish. Everyone knew what happened if they broke. Eddie listened to the discussion silently, his mind already working on the problem. The railroad embankment was good defensive terrain, elevated position with clear fields of fire, but there wasn't enough wire, not enough prepared positions, not enough time to build proper fortifications. Unless you didn't build proper fortifications. Unless you built something else. "Sir," Eddie said quietly, interrupting a lieutenant's pessimistic assessment of their ammunition situation. "Permission to take a work detail forward. I need 6 hours and every piece of wire, rope, or cable we can find." The room went silent. Everyone knew who Eddie was by now. The story of the wire ghost had spread through every British unit on the Western Front. Some of the officers looked skeptical. Others looked hopeful. Pembroke just looked tired. "Ashworth, we need conventional defenses. We need firing positions, wire obstacles in proper parallel rows, clearly marked fields of fire. We need, with respect, sir, we need whatever gives us the best chance of surviving the next 12 hours. Eddie's voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. Certainty. "I can't stop a division with wire, but I can slow them down. I can confuse them. I can make them second-guess every step. I can buy you time." "Time," Pembroke repeated slowly. He looked around at the other officers, saw the same desperate calculation in every face. They were all doing the same math. Conventional defenses wouldn't hold against the German assault. They needed something unconventional. Something the Germans wouldn't expect. Something impossible. "Do it," Pembroke said finally. "You have 6 hours. Take whoever you need." Eddie stood. "I need volunteers who trust me, sir. Men who'll follow orders without understanding them." "You need the wire ghost's disciples," Sergeant Collins said from the back of the room. He was grinning, though his eyes were hard. "And I know exactly where to find them." Eddie worked with 30 men this time, the survivors of his original platoon, plus volunteers from other units who'd heard the stories and wanted to be part of whatever the wire ghost was building. They worked in broad daylight, which was dangerous but necessary. You can't build a psychological maze in the dark. The Germans could see them working, could drop occasional shells on their position, but they didn't know what was being built. It looked like chaos, random wire placement, obstacles in seemingly useless positions, gaps that appeared deliberately left open. The German observers, watching through field glasses from their forward positions, couldn't make sense of it. That was exactly the point. Eddie was building something that looked vulnerable but was actually a trap, something that appeared to be the disorganized work of desperate soldiers but was actually a precisely engineered maze of death. He was using every principle he discovered on Passchendaele Ridge, but on a larger scale, with more sophistication, with 6 months of reflection and refinement behind his choices. He created false positions, obvious places where defenders would logically place machine guns but left them empty. He created real positions in places that appeared useless but actually provided perfect enfilade fire into the maze's channeling corridors. He built obstacles that looked solid but would collapse when crossed, and obstacles that looked weak but were actually unbreakable. He created sound wires throughout the system, not just at the entrances, so that any movement anywhere would telegraph itself to the defenders. Most importantly, he built confusion. He designed the wire maze so that no matter which way the Germans entered, they would immediately lose their sense of direction. Every corridor looked the same. Every turn revealed more wire. Landmarks were deliberately placed to be ambiguous. Was that damaged concrete pillar 50 yards behind you or 50 yards ahead? Was that shell hole on your left or your right? Where the hell was the railroad embankment you were supposed to assault? It's like that Greek myth, Private Morrison said, watching Eddie position another stake at a precise angle. The labyrinth with the monster in it. The Minotaur, another soldier supplied. That's the one. Except in this story, we're all the monster. Eddie didn't comment. He was focused on the work, his ruined hands gripping wire despite the pain, his mind holding the entire three-dimensional structure of the maze simultaneously. He could see it as if from above every corridor, every trap, every channeling point, every kill zone. It existed in his head as clearly as blueprints, as completely as a finished building. When they were done, when the sun was setting and German artillery was beginning its preparatory bombardment for the next day's assault, Eddie walked the defenders through their positions. He assigned each man to specific firing points and gave them simple instructions. Don't shoot until I shoot. Don't shoot at men you can see easily. They're bait. Watch the places where the wire narrows. That's where they'll bunch up. That's where you fire. 3-round bursts maximum. Then move to your alternate position. Make them think there's more of us than there are. Make them think we're everywhere. And what will you be doing, Corporal? A young lieutenant from a Welsh regiment asked. Eddie picked up a canvas bag filled with tent stakes, wire cutters, and rough tools. I'll be in the maze, adjusting things, making them more afraid. Alone? That's suicide. Maybe, Eddie said. But it worked before. The German assault came at dawn, just as predicted. 2 regiments, nearly 2,000 men, advancing in proper assault formation toward what they believed was a hastily defended position held by a skeleton crew of exhausted British soldiers. They'd been winning for 3 days straight. Momentum was on their side. This would be another easy breakthrough. The first wave entered the maze cautiously, expecting immediate resistance. When none came, they moved faster, more confidently. The wire obstacles appeared manageable, damaged by shellfire, full of gaps, nothing that would stop a determined assault. They were 100 yards into the maze when they realized something was wrong. The railroad embankment they were supposed to assault should have been visible by now, but it wasn't. Or maybe it was that it to the left? No, to the right? And why did every direction look exactly the same? And where was the rest of the assault force? They'd entered with a full company on their flanks, but now they couldn't see anyone. Just wire and fog, and the strange sensation of being watched. That's when the wire started singing. Eddie had positioned himself in the heart of the maze, in a small, cleared space that gave him access to multiple corridors. He had sound wires running to this position from dozens of places, and he could tell from the different pitches and tones exactly where enemy soldiers were moving. It was like conducting an orchestra where the instruments were men who wanted to kill you. He waited until 3 groups had penetrated deep into the maze, waited until they were separated and disoriented and starting to panic, and then he cut a release wire. 20 yards of barbed wire fell on the northern group like a net dropping from heaven. Men screamed, fell, tried to run, and only tangled themselves more thoroughly. Their screaming brought the other groups running bad idea, because Eddie had designed the maze so that the fastest route to any sound was actually a channeling corridor that led to a kill zone. British machine guns opened up from positions the Germans hadn't even seen, firing down the length of the corridors with devastating effect. Men fell in heaps. Survivors dove for cover that wasn't actually cover, just depressions that Eddie had calculated would feel safe but actually exposed them to enfilade fire from another position. And in the maze itself, the wire ghost was working. Eddie moved through the chaos with brutal efficiency, using tent stakes and wire to disable soldiers who were too tangled or confused to defend themselves effectively. He didn't try to kill everyone, he tried to create maximum chaos and noise. A wounded man screaming in German did more to break morale than a quietly dead man. He triggered collapse traps. He released tension wires that whipped across corridors at chest height. He used wire cutters not to cut his own men free, but to selectively cut German soldiers' equipment, leaving them partially disarmed or unable to move their arms effectively. The second wave of the German assault, watching their comrades disappear into the wire maze and hearing the screaming that emerged, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. British artillery finally ranged correctly after the confusion of the retreat, began dropping shells into the open ground behind the maze, cutting off retreat and reinforcement. The German regimental commander, watching from a safe distance, made the only logical choice. He suspended the assault. You don't feed men into a meat grinder when you don't understand what's killing them. The battle for Villers-Bretonneux continued for days after that, but the railroad embankment held. The Australian divisions arrived as promised, established proper defensive lines, and eventually counterattacked to retake the ground the Germans had captured. But the critical moment, the moment when the German offensive could have broken through to open country, had been stopped by 400 exhausted soldiers, a railroad embankment, and a carpenter from Bolton who understood how fear moved through groups of men like stress moved through roof beams. Eddie had bought them 12 hours. He'd actually bought them 15. When the position was finally relieved and Eddie's scratch force was pulled back to rest, the casualty count told a remarkable story. Of the 400 defenders, 73 had been killed and 142 wounded, brutal numbers that represented nearly 54% casualties. But the German forces that assaulted them had suffered over 600 casualties, most of them in the first hour of fighting, most of them in or around the wire maze. A 3-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of the defenders was extraordinary. A 3-to-1 ratio achieved by an improvised defense force against a well-organized assault was unprecedented. British High Command didn't know what to do with Eddie Ashworth anymore. He was clearly valuable, his methods worked, his results were undeniable. But he was also troubling. He didn't follow doctrine. He couldn't be replicated. His tactics were entirely dependent on his unique way of seeing the battlefield, and you couldn't teach that in training camp. He was, in the eyes of the military establishment, more useful than he was threatening, but only barely. They promoted him to sergeant. They gave him another commendation, another citation carefully worded to avoid specifics. They started including him in defensive planning meetings, though they rarely took his suggestions seriously, and they whispered about him. Not just soldiers anymore, but officers, staff planners, intelligence analysts. The wire ghost had become a phenomenon that transcended military ranks. He was studied, analyzed, mythologized. Reports about his actions circulated through military headquarters across the Allied powers. The French wanted to borrow him. The Americans wanted to interview him. The Canadians wanted him to train their engineers. Eddie refused all of it. He just wanted to stay with his battalion, with the men who understood him, with Captain Pembroke, who'd given him his first chance to prove that slow thinking and strange ideas could be more deadly than fast reflexes and traditional courage. The war dragged on through the summer of 1918. The German spring offensive had failed. The Allies were counterattacking, pushing the exhausted German army back toward the border. Everyone could feel that the end was coming, though no one knew when. Eddie continued to work, building defensive positions, training soldiers, refining his techniques. His hands hurt constantly, now the damaged nerves sending phantom pain signals that no amount of morphine could fully suppress. But he worked through it, because soldiers were still dying, and if his strange carpentry-derived theories could save even a few more lives before the war ended, it was worth the pain. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally stopped. The armistice had been signed. The war was over. Eddie Ashworth sat in a bombed-out farmhouse in Belgium, listening to the silence, the first real silence in 4 years, and didn't know what to feel. Relief, certainly, but also a strange emptiness. He'd spent 4 years learning how to turn battlefields into mazes, how to make wire into weapons, how to think like both predator and architect simultaneously. What was he supposed to do with those skills now? "You all right, Sergeant?" Private Morrison asked, sitting down beside him in the ruins. Eddie looked at his scarred hands, flexing the fingers that would never quite work right again. "I don't know how to build normal things anymore," he said quietly. "I only know how to build things that kill." Morrison lit 2 cigarettes and passed one to Eddie. "Then I guess it's bloody good the killing's done." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun set over a landscape that would take generations to fully heal. Edmund Ashworth returned to Bolton in January 1919, carrying his duffel bag, his military medal, and hands that would never grip a saw straight again. His father's carpentry business had survived the war, but barely. Thomas Ashworth was older now, slower, and the few apprentices he'd trained had either been killed in France or had never come back the same. "I saved your spot," Thomas said when Eddie walked into the workshop. "Thought you might want to take over eventually. Build it into something proper." Eddie looked around at the workshop he'd grown up in, at the tools that had taught him angles and stress and load distribution, and shook his head slowly. "I can't, Da. My hands don't work right anymore. Can't do fine carpentry with hands like these." Thomas nodded sadly, unsurprised. "The war take that from you?" "No," Eddie said, looking at his scarred palms. "The war gave me this. I just gave it something else in return." He didn't explain what he meant. His father didn't ask. Eddie took a job as a site foreman for a construction company, work that required planning and supervision rather than direct craftsmanship. He was good at it. His ability to see structural problems before they happened, to understand load paths and stress concentrations, made him invaluable for complex projects. The company prospered. Eddie made a decent living, but he was never quite normal again. He would wake screaming from nightmares about wire. He couldn't walk through even simple obstacles without his mind automatically calculating optimal paths and channeling corridors. When his nephew asked him to help build a backyard fence, Eddie designed something so psychologically oppressive that the boy's mother asked him, politely but firmly, to never help with home projects again. The men from his battalion would visit sometimes, the ones who survived. They'd sit in Eddie's small flat, drinking tea, not saying much, just being in the presence of someone who understood. They never called him by his name anymore. Among themselves, privately, they still called him the Wire Ghost, and they said it with the same mixture of fear and reverence they'd said it with in the trenches. Captain Pembroke, who'd ended the war as a major, stayed in contact with Eddie for the rest of his life. They wrote letters every month, Pembroke from his estate in Surrey, Eddie from his flat in Bolton. The letters were never long, never sentimental, but they maintained a connection forged in mud and wire, an impossible survival. In one letter, written in 1924, Pembroke asked the question that military historians would debate for decades. Could you teach someone else to do what you did? Or was it something uniquely yours? Eddie's response was characteristically precise. "I could teach the techniques, sir. The wire placement, the channeling principles, the sound markers, but I couldn't teach someone to see the patterns the way I see them. That's not a skill. That's just how my brain works. Always has. The war didn't create it. The war just gave it a purpose." The British Army did try to incorporate some of Eddie's principles into defensive doctrine, with limited success. Engineers studied his diagrams, analyzed his mazes, attempted to replicate his results. But something essential was always missing. The designs that looked exactly like Eddie's on paper didn't work the same way in practice. It turned out that Eddie's genius wasn't in the physical arrangement of wire and stakes, it was in the invisible psychological architecture he built into every system. You couldn't teach that from blueprints. By the 1932nd, as Europe stumbled toward another war, military theorists were moving away from static defensive warfare anyway. The next war would be about mobility, tanks, aircraft, not about trenches and wire. Eddie's techniques, which had been revolutionary in 1918, were already becoming historical curiosities. Eddie married in 1927, a quiet woman named Margaret, who worked in a library and didn't ask him questions about the war. They had 2 children. He was a distant but not unkind father, the sort of parent who showed affection through careful planning rather than emotional expression. His son would later describe him as a man who was always calculating something, even when he was just sitting in his chair reading the newspaper. During World War II, now in his late 40s, Eddie tried to enlist again. He was rejected immediately, too old, too damaged, no longer fit for service. But the War Office did send him a letter requesting he consult on some defensive fortification projects for coastal defenses. Eddie politely declined. "I built mazes for killing Germans," he told Margaret when she asked why he'd refused. "I won't do it again, not even for king and country. Once was enough." He died in 1962, at age 67, of lung cancer, probably caused by years of breathing in chemical gas residue during the war. His obituary in the Bolton Evening News was 3 paragraphs long and mentioned his military medal, but not how he'd earned it. The obituary writer clearly had no idea that the quiet foreman who died had once been one of the most unusual combat soldiers in British military history. At his funeral, 7 old men showed up, uninvited survivors from his original platoon, now in their 60s and 70s, traveling from across England to pay respects. They stood together, separate from the family, and when the service was done, they filed past the coffin one by one. Each man touched it briefly, whispering something inaudible. Later, someone asked what they'd said. "Thank you, wire ghost," replied Private Morrison, now a grandfather with trembling hands and clouded eyes. "We just said thank you." In military archives across Britain and Germany, classified documents from World War I were slowly being unsealed. Among them were the after-action reports from November 9th, 1917, and March 21st, 1918. Historians reading these reports in the 1972 and 1980 would puzzle over the references to unusual defensive techniques and improvised obstacle systems that seemed to produce impossible results. A few researchers, digging deeper, found the name Edmund Ashworth. Fewer still found the survivors who could explain what had actually happened. By the time the full story was finally documented in military history journals in the 1990s, there were no living witnesses left, just documents, diagrams, and increasingly mythologized stories about a carpenter from Bolton who'd learned to kill with wire and tent stakes. The German military kept their own records, of course. The reports about Der Drahtgeist were never fully declassified, but fragments appeared in histories of the war. The 195th Infantry Division, which had assaulted Passchendaele Ridge, mentioned in their regimental history a particularly vexing defensive position that had been unusually costly to assault. The report included a sketch of Eddie's wire maze, drawn by a German engineering officer who'd studied the position after the war ended. That sketch hangs now in the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden, in an exhibit about battlefield innovations of World War I. The placard beside it reads in German, "Example of improvised defensive fortification, Passchendaele Sector, 1917. Architect unknown. System demonstrated unusual sophistication in psychological warfare applications." Architect unknown. Eddie would have appreciated the irony. He'd never wanted to be known. He just wanted to keep his friends alive, using the only skills he had, skills that everyone had mocked as useless, right up until the moment they became the difference between survival and annihilation. In the vast catalog of World War I military innovations, tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, modern artillery, Edmund Ashworth's wire mazes barely register as a footnote. They couldn't be mass-produced, couldn't be taught effectively, couldn't be replicated by anyone who didn't possess Eddie's unique combination of carpentry knowledge, geometric intuition, and psychological insight. But for the men who survived because of those mazes, for the soldiers who watched the impossible happen in the mud of Passchendaele and the chaos of Villers-Bretonneux, Eddie Ashworth was more than an innovator. He was proof that the deadliest weapons in war aren't always the ones that make the loudest noise or create the biggest explosion. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the strange ones, the ones that come from desperate men with unusual minds who refuse to accept that being different means being useless. The British Army gave Eddie 2 commendations, a promotion and a pension. History gave him a few paragraphs in specialized military journals, a mention in books about unusual combat tactics, and the occasional reference in documentaries about World War I. But the men who fought beside him, who saw what he built and how he fought, gave him something more valuable, a legend. The wire ghost. The carpenter's son who learned to kill with rusty wire and tent stakes. The man who turned the most ridiculed skills in the battalion into the most feared techniques on the Western Front. The soldier everyone underestimated, right up until he did the impossible. And when it was over, when the guns fell silent and the survivors went home, no one ever mocked him again. His weapon was ancient, as old as humans had been building traps to catch prey. His technique was improvised, born from desperation and necessity rather than doctrine and training. His legend is eternal, whispered still in military academies, studied by tacticians, remembered by those who understand that sometimes the most innovative solutions come from the minds everyone assumes are too slow, too strange, too different to matter.